Hello, and welcome to Creating Inclusive Educational History Books, an introduction, with me, James Paul. After many years of combining writing textbooks with teaching history and running a secondary school humanities department, I now write full-time. I work with numerous publishers writing both trade and educational history books for the UK and international markets. I also work as a development editor and conduct inclusivity reviews. By watching this short video, you will hopefully be left better informed on the principles that underpin creating more inclusive history books. The first part of this video will look at conscious language and the importance of the choices that you make when it comes to the words that you use. Part 2 will focus on the concept of decolonising curriculums, exactly what that term means and how it can impact on how inclusive your book is. As writers and educators, we know exactly how powerful language can be. Spoken words can live on in people's minds long after the person who has said them has forgotten all about them. Words committed to the page obviously have the potential to impact many more people and to live on for even longer. This has to be borne in mind at all times as you write your book, and the young people who will be reading your words must remain at the forefront of your thoughts. Writing educational history books puts us in an incredibly privileged and important position. As you choose your words, you have to consider the impact, intended or otherwise, that every one of those words might have. Could your choice of words be perceived to be excluding or hurtful in any way? Even if they don't seem hurtful or excluding to you, could they be interpreted that way by other groups or communities? If so, your book is not as inclusive as it could be, or as inclusive as you'd want it to be. This process of carefully considering how your words might negatively impact potential readers is known as using conscious language. Nobody writing an educational history book sets out to cause offence. But intention isn't the important thing here, it's how our words or our messages are received. By using conscious language, we are mitigating the possibility that our writing could have a negative impact on our readers. These considerations are vital no matter what type of writing you're doing, or in the case of educational books, what subject area. But they are particularly important when it comes to writing about gender and age, ethnicity, religion, socioeconomic status, and sexual orientation. All things that are commonly referenced during the course of writing a history book. And this is why conscious language is so vitally important when it comes to writing an inclusive history book. So that's the principle of conscious language. But applying it in practice and finding the most appropriate word or term is not always so straightforward. Language evolves, and I'm sure we can all think of terms that were once thought of as appropriate that are not considered so now. Undoubtedly, the language that we use today will develop connotations or become appropriated and will no longer be considered acceptable. Your editor will no doubt give you a style guide that will inform you of the terms to use when referring to commonly occurring or possibly contentious areas in your book. Now, these will vary widely depending on the period and geographical location covered by your book. The terms included on a style guide for a book on the American West could be quite different to those in one for a book on Norman England or revolutionary Russia, for example. But for the purposes of this video, I will go through a couple of examples of terms that could be used in any of these topics and explain the reasoning over why the terminology used has changed in recent years. I will also explain why the replacement term is considered more appropriate and more inclusive. I'm sure we are all very familiar with the term slave. Sadly, slavery has commonly occurred throughout history, and you may have books on the American West that refer to the Exodus as former slaves, or some on Norman England that detail Vikings capturing slaves, or seen the term slave used in reference to serfdom in Tsarist Russia. So why, if it is a term that has been commonly used and is widely understood, would I recommend replacing it with the term enslaved person? Well, firstly, including the word person helps maintain focus on the fact that we are in fact discussing a person, a human being. Secondly, the term enslaved serves to remind us that this person has undergone a process. Enslavement is something that has happened to them. There is nothing innate or inherent in enslavement. The term slave can imply that there is. Nobody is predisposed to enslavement, but the term slave can imply that they are. The term slave can other people. It can serve to dehumanise them. Now, of course, many people use the term slave with absolutely no intention of dehumanising anyone. But remember, the intention of words is never the important thing. It is always how they are received. Similarly, I would recommend avoiding using the prefix "the" when referring to a group or community. Now, referring to the poor or the Jews or the disabled can also feel dehumanising. Using terms such as people on low incomes or Jewish people completely avoids this. Things are slightly more nuanced when it comes to writing about people with disabilities, as there are preferences within those communities. Some people prefer identity first language and would therefore choose the term disabled people. Others prefer person first language, in which case they would choose the term people with disabilities. Now, normally a discussion or exchange of emails with your editor will take place and you'll come to a decision over which terms are most appropriate and inclusive for your book. We have obviously barely begun to scratch the surface here, but hopefully I've explained some of the principles behind why someone's commonplace terms are no longer being used and why their substitutes are considered more inclusive. You could use these principles to look at your manuscript and identify words and terms that might be unintentionally excluding. To learn more, I would highly recommend the Conscious Style Guide by Karen Yin. It gives advice on alternative and more inclusive terms that could be used when addressing gender, sexuality, age, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and other areas. I think it will make your writing more inclusive and it might even change the way that you look at the world. I'd also check out Crystal Shelley's Conscious Language Toolkits. These come in the form of PDFs that are available to download, and I've included the links to these in the description. And remember, as well as being inclusive, the words you choose also have to sound good, scan well, and fit in the space available on the page. And if you're not already familiar with the term over matter, you soon will be. Whereas the term conscious language is pretty self-explanatory, the meaning of decolonisation might not be so clear. The term decolonisation came from recognising the fact that nearly all of our academic disciplines, including history and many of our academic institutions, were born out of the colonial system. Many of the world's leading universities not only grew out of the colonial system, but were a central part of it. You might even argue that universities were key weapons in the colonial system's armoury and that they were used to impose certain perspectives, beliefs and types of knowledge onto colonial populations. All 8 of the Ivy League universities in the United States, for example, were literally founded by colonists, and universities all across Central and Southern America were established by Spain. Now, this has led to the creation of a curriculum that has a certain perspective and that is colonial in essence. Decolonisation is about recognising that and acknowledging that. It is then about introducing material and perspectives that don't exclusively come from the global north. Decolonising history books is not about removing or replacing established and understood perspectives of the global north. But to create more inclusive history books, we have to take every opportunity to include different perspectives and histories from those of male, able-bodied Western Europeans. This can take many forms, and the specific examples that you could include in your book will obviously depend to a large degree upon the period and the geographical location that you are writing about. But here are a couple of examples that might serve as useful cases in point. Now, the sophistication, majesty and influence of ancient Egypt is something that is frequently referenced when writing history books on a variety of periods and locations. Specifically and explicitly framing the history of ancient Egypt as African history can fundamentally change people's perspectives. Because all too often, Africa only features in history books and in lessons in UK schools as part of schemes looking at colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. Ancient Egypt can provide a dazzling counterpoint of agency and innovation and artistry to the subjugation and enslavement of colonialism. Now, this could completely shift perceptions of both what Africa was and what Africa is. The development of the European Renaissance during the 15th and the 16th century are commonly taught in UK schools, often through the prism of medicine or crime or the Tudors. A decolonised approach to writing about the Renaissance might stress that its scientific developments, of which there are many, such as Vesalius's groundbreaking book on anatomy, were almost entirely dependent on the invention of paper, an invention that had occurred in China at the start of the 2nd century CE. It might choose to stress that the European explorers of this time, such as Columbus and Vasco da Gama and Drake, they were only able to navigate to uncharted lands because of the development of the magnetic compass, a development that had occurred in China at the start of the 11th century CE. It might stress that the Europeans' ability to then subjugate and overpower the population of the land they travelled to depended to a large degree on their possession of gunpowder, which had been invented in China at the start of the 9th century CE. Now, all of this could help reframe the European Renaissance as a continuation of global development rather than the single isolated explosion of innovation in Western Europe that it is so often portrayed. Now, these are but two brief examples, and there were countless more, and they could incorporate gender and age and sexual orientation and economic status. Decolonisation is not about removing the perspectives and the histories of the global north. It is about adding to and augmenting these perspectives to provide fresh contexts. As writers, we are not the sole arbiters of what is included in our books. The content of a textbook is governed to a large degree by the exam specifications or curriculums. Authors of trade books are always working with detailed briefs, and we are all working within page constraints or word limits, trying to ensure there is enough space for pictures and diagrams, and often waging a war against overmatter. But creating decolonised history books is important, not only because they are more reflective of and accessible for today's readers and classrooms, but because they also improve the study of history for everybody. A 2023 government report on the state of history teaching in England and Wales asserted that the historical content currently being taught, or the substantive historical knowledge as the report framed it, was often too narrow in many schools. It argued for establishing a broader hinterland of historical knowledge in students' minds. By doing this, students were more likely to, quote, identify recurring themes, concepts and phenomena that helps them learn more easily about other topics, end quotes. A broader base of substantive knowledge has what the report calls generative power. It enriches existing knowledge and enables parallels to be drawn and contrasts to be made and events to be seen in new historical perspectives. In other words, no historical learning is wasted. It all enriches and it all helps. If you'd like to read the Ofsted Report into history teaching in its entirety, you can find a link to it in the description. I've also provided a link to an article that I wrote for DK Learning about the implications of the report. It's important to remember that writing educational history books is never a solo pursuit. You will be supported by editors and development editors, and someone like me will undoubtedly conduct an inclusivity review of your book. Now, these people are not marking your work or criticising your choices, but they are working with you and bringing different perspectives to help produce the best and the most inclusive work possible. Now, I've had books reviewed and edited countless times, and I would be lying if I said it was always an easy or an enjoyable experience. But it is always a learning experience, and it invariably makes my writing better. So take a deep breath and embrace the feedback when it comes. Because just as with the study of history in general, the more perspectives involved, the better the outcomes. So if you're a writer who would like some help or some advice in making your manuscript more inclusive, or if you're a publisher who would like to engage me to conduct an inclusivity review, please do get in touch. I'll be delighted to help.